Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Alfred Adler, the physician of social belonging and striving. Together and apart, they walked the corridors of early psychoanalysis as companions who would become philosophical opponents, each carving a path that diverged sharply from the other as they sought to understand what moves the human heart. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of human suffering, one seeing the dance of archetypes and the call toward individuation, the other discovering the wounds of inferiority and the upward reach toward significance. Their dialogue, whether spoken in the cramped meeting rooms of Vienna or across the distance, of competing theories, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Adler as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the opening years of the 20th century, when the old world still held its breath before the storms that would reshape everything, three men gathered in Vienna around the radical ideas of Sigmund Freud. They were physicians of the mind, explorers of that dark continent that lay beneath consciousness, cartographers attempting to map invisible geography of human suffering and desire. Freud was the elder, the master, the one who had dared to speak of sexuality and the unconscious when polite society pretended neither existed. Beside him sat two younger men, both brilliant, both ambitious, both destined to break away and forge their own paths through the wilderness of the psyche. One was Carl Gustav Jung, son of a Swiss pastor, haunted by visions and dreams, drawn to mythology and the numinous dimensions of human experience. The other was Alfred Adler, son of a Viennese grain merchant, born into a Jewish family in the outskirts of the great imperial city, a man who had known illness as a child and who carried within him a fierce determination to understand the social forces that shaped human personality and destiny. They met in those Wednesday evening gatherings, the Psychological Wednesday Society, where Freud held court and ideas flowed like wine in the smoky rooms of Burgas 19. These were intimate affairs, fervent with the energy of discovery, where each participant would present a paper and the others would dissect it with surgical precision or philosophical passion. Jung came from Zurich, making the journey to Vienna like a pilgrim seeking wisdom from the master. Adler was already there, a local physician, one of the first to join Freud's circle, skeptical and independent even from the beginning. To understand the dialogue between Jung and Adler, we must first understand how different their worlds were, how divergent the streams that fed their thinking. Jung grew up in the landscapes of Switzerland, surrounded by mountains and lakes, in a household thick with religious atmosphere and unspoken tensions. His father was a pastor who had lost his faith but continued to perform the rituals, a spiritual hollowness that young Carl could sense like a ghost in the house. His mother was mysterious, shifting between personalities, speaking sometimes in a voice that seemed not entirely her own. Jung was a solitary child, given to elaborate fantasies, disturbed by dreams that seemed to come from some ancient source beyond his personal experience. He studied medicine, then psychiatry, working at the Berghelsley Hospital under Egon Bleuler, where he encountered the full spectrum of human madness and began to develop his word association tests. But Jung was never content with mere clinical observation. He read voraciously in mythology, comparative religion, alchemy, Gnosticism, seeking patterns that might connect the visions of his psychotic patients with the symbols that appeared in ancient texts and tribal rituals. When he discovered Freud's work, it seemed at first like a key that might unlock the mysteries he sensed but could not yet articulate. Alfred Adler's childhood was entirely different, rooted not in the alpine mysticism of Switzerland but in the complex social world of Vienna, that great cosmopolitan crossroads where Jews and Christians, aristocrats, and workers, artists, and merchants mingled in an empire that was already beginning its slow collapse. Adler was born in 1870 in Rudolfsheim, then a suburb of Vienna, the second of 6 children. His early years were marked by illness and near-death experiences. He suffered from rickets, a disease of malnutrition that weakened his bones, and at age 5 he nearly died of pneumonia. He witnessed the death of a younger brother in the bed next to his own. These experiences of physical weakness and the brush with mortality planted seeds in the young Adler's mind. He became acutely aware of his body's limitations, of how vulnerability and strength shaped one's experience of the world. Later, this would blossom into his theory of organ inferiority and the striving for compensation, but first, it shaped his determination to become a doctor, to overcome through knowledge and skill what he could not overcome through physical prowess. Adler studied medicine at the University of Vienna, graduating in 1895. He established a practice first in ophthalmology, then as a general practitioner in a working-class district of Vienna. Unlike Jung, who worked in the controlled environment of a psychiatric hospital, Adler saw patients in their homes, witnessed poverty and social struggle firsthand, treated circus performers and their families, people whose very livelihood depended on their physical capabilities and their ability to perform despite injury or limitation. This grounded him in the concrete realities of social life in a way that Jung, for all his genius, never quite experienced. When Adler encountered Freud's work, he was already practicing medicine and developing his own ideas. In 1902, he wrote a defense of Freud's interpretation of dreams against critics in the medical establishment. Freud, grateful for this support, invited Adler to join his Wednesday evening discussion group, but Adler was never Freud's student in the way Jung briefly was. He came to the psychoanalytic circle as an independent thinker, already skeptical of some of Freud's central tenets, particularly the overwhelming emphasis on sexuality as the primary driver of human behavior. Jung and Adler thus arrived at psychoanalysis from opposite directions, bringing with them radically different sensibilities. Jung was the romantic, the mystic, the one drawn to the symbolic and the transcendent. He sought in the unconscious not just repressed sexual wishes, but cosmic patterns, archetypal forms, the collective memory of humanity itself. Adler was the pragmatist, the social reformer, the one attuned to power dynamics and social hierarchies. He sought in the psyche not primordial symbols, but the marks left by social experience, by the feeling of being less than others, by the compensatory strivings that shaped personality and determined the trajectory of a life. In those early years, in the first decade of the 1900s, they sat in the same rooms, listened to the same lectures, debated the same cases, but they were already moving in different directions, like rivers that briefly flow parallel before diverging to seek their separate seas. The break came first with Adler, who grew increasingly vocal in his disagreements with Freud. By 1911, the tension had become unbearable. Adler resigned as president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society and left to found his own school, which he would call individual psychology, though paradoxically its focus was intensely social. Jung's break came later, in 1912 and 13, a more painful and dramatic rupture that left both Jung and Freud wounded. Jung had been the chosen heir, the one Freud hoped would carry psychoanalysis beyond its Jewish Viennese origins into the broader world. But Jung could not accept Freud's reductionist view of the unconscious, could not see the human psyche as merely a cauldron of repressed sexuality. Jung needed to explore the spiritual dimensions, the creative possibilities, the transpersonal aspects of the unconscious that Freud dismissed as mysticism or regression. So, by the time World War I shattered the old order, all three men had gone their separate ways. Freud remained in Vienna, the patriarch of psychoanalysis, increasingly rigid in his orthodoxy. Jung retreated into a period of intense inner exploration, what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, emerging with his theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Adler developed individual psychology, establishing clinics and training centers, writing prolifically, traveling to lecture, bringing his ideas about inferiority, feelings, and social interest to ever wider audiences. They would rarely speak again. Adler and Freud became bitter enemies. Jung and Freud's relationship ended in painful silence. But Adler and Jung, curiously, never engaged in the same kind of personal animosity. They simply went their separate ways, each convinced the other was focusing on the wrong dimensions of human experience. Yet in their very divergence lies a profound dialogue about what it means to be human, about whether we are primarily social beings or primarily symbolic beings, about whether the psyche faces outward to the community or inward to the archetypal realm. Let us pause here for a moment, as we might pause on a nighttime walk to let our eyes adjust to the darkness. Notice how different were the landscapes of these two men's inner lives. Jung carried within him the weight of religious questions, the numinous experiences that came unbidden in dreams and visions, the sense that the psyche was connected to something vast and transpersonal, a collective layer of mind that preceded individual experience and connected all humanity through shared symbolic forms. When Jung looked at a patient, he saw not just a person struggling with neurotic symptoms, but a soul caught in the grip of archetypal dramas, playing out ancient patterns, called toward a destiny of individuation, of becoming whole, by integrating the disparate parts of the self, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, ego and self. Adler carried within him the memory of childhood weakness, the burning desire to overcome limitation, the acute awareness of social comparison and social positioning. When Adler looked at a patient, he saw someone navigating a social world, someone who had developed a private logic and a lifestyle based on early experiences of inferiority or superiority, someone striving toward goals that often remained unconscious, but that organized all behavior around the need to feel significant, to belong, to find a place in the human community. Where Jung saw symbols, Adler saw strategies. Where Jung heard the voice of archetypes, Adler heard the echo of social relationships. Consider their different relationships to the body, that vessel that carries us through the world. Jung was relatively indifferent to the physical dimension of existence, at least in his theoretical work. His psychology was a psychology of images, of dreams and visions, of the symbolic life. The body appeared primarily as a source of instinct that needed to be integrated, or as the carrier of the shadow, the repository of what consciousness rejected. But the body itself was not the focus. Jung's attention was on psychic reality, on the images that arose in the mind, on the dialogue between ego and unconscious, on the symbolic transformation that he called individuation. Adler began with the body. His earliest papers dealt with organ inferiority, with the idea that weaknesses in particular organs or bodily systems created a felt sense of deficiency that the individual would then attempt to compensate for, either in that same area or in another domain entirely. A child with weak eyes might develop extraordinary powers of observation, or might become a visual artist, transforming weakness into creative strength. A child with a weak constitution might become a doctor, as Adler himself had done. But more broadly, Adler saw the body as the site of our first experiences of limitation and capability, of dependence and vulnerability. The infant is helpless, smaller and weaker than everyone around it, and this foundational experience of inferiority becomes the template for all later feelings of inadequacy. From this bodily beginning, Adler moved outward into the social realm. The child's feelings about its body, its capabilities, its value, are shaped by social comparison and social feedback. The family constellation, birth order, parental attitudes, sibling relationships becomes the first social world in which the child must find a place. Am I the firstborn, enjoying the undivided attention of my parents until a usurper arrives? Am I the middle child, squeezed between older and younger siblings, struggling to find a unique identity? Am I the youngest, potentially pampered, but also always the smallest, the one running to catch up? Am I the only child, the center of attention, but also burdened by expectations? These social positions, Adler argued, shape personality in profound ways. Each child develops a private logic, a set of unconscious assumptions about the world and about what strategies will work to secure belonging and significance. One child might decide that the way to be valued is through achievement and perfection, becoming the good child who excels in school and never causes trouble. Another might decide that direct competition is futile and seek attention through misbehavior or illness. Another might develop a creative approach, finding a unique niche that no sibling occupies. These patterns, established early, become the lifestyle Adler's term for the characteristic way a person moves through life, the consistent style of striving that can be discerned across all domains of behavior. Jung knew about birth order and family dynamics, of course, but he gave them little theoretical weight. For Jung, the crucial formative experiences were not the social ones, but the encounters with the numinous, the moments when the archetypal unconscious broke through into consciousness. He remembered playing as a child, sitting on a stone by the lake, and suddenly being seized by the question, am I the one sitting on the stone, or am I the stone being sat upon? This kind of existential vertigo, this dissolution of the boundary between self and world, was what shaped psychological development in Jung's view. Not birth order, but archetypal encounters. Not social comparison, but symbolic experiences. Their therapeutic approaches reflected these different orientations. When Jung sat with a patient, He would explore dreams in elaborate detail, asking for associations, adding amplifications from mythology and comparative religion, helping the patient see the archetypal patterns underlying their personal struggles. A dream of descending into a cave might be connected to the night sea journey, to the hero's descent into the underworld, to Jonah in the belly of the whale, to initiatory rituals of death and rebirth. Jung would spend session after session on a single dream, unpacking its layers of meaning, treating it as a message from the unconscious that needed to be understood and integrated. Adler approached dreams differently. He saw them not as messages from a deeper self, but as rehearsals for waking life, as continuations of the same goals and strategies that organize the person's daytime behavior. A patient who dreams of being chaste is expressing in symbolic form the same feeling of inadequacy and fear of failure that governs their waking hours. The dream doesn't need elaborate amplification. It needs to be understood as part of the lifestyle, as revealing the direction of the person's striving and the obstacles they perceive. Adler would ask, "What is the problem you're facing in life? What is this dream preparing you for, or warning you against? How does this dream serve your goal, your private logic?" For Adler, therapy was fundamentally about encouragement and reorientation. Neurosis arose from discouragement, from the feeling that one's goals were unattainable through socially useful means. The neurotic person had developed an exaggerated feeling of inferiority and compensated with an equally exaggerated striving for superiority, often expressed in antisocial or self-defeating ways. The task of therapy was to help the person develop what Adler called Gemeinschaftsgefühl, social interest, community, feeling a sense of belonging to the human community, and a willingness to contribute to the common good rather than focusing exclusively on personal superiority. This was practical, pragmatic, focused on real-world functioning. Adler wanted his patients to work, to love, to participate in social life. He saw psychological health in terms of social adaptation, not in terms of mystical wholeness or symbolic integration. A person was healthy when they could cooperate with others, when they contributed to society, when they felt they belonged and had a useful role to play. Neurosis was essentially antisocial, a turning away from the community into the prison of private ambition and isolated striving. Jung would have found this approach reductive, even superficial. For him, the goal of therapy was not social adaptation, but individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, of integrating the rejected and unconscious parts of the psyche, of entering into relationship with the self. That archetype of wholeness that transcended the ego's limited perspective. Social adaptation might be part of this process, but it was not the goal. Indeed, Jung often found himself counseling patients to resist social expectations, to honor the call of their own development, even when it meant appearing strange or unconventional to others. Individuation, Jung wrote, is an inherently lonely process. It requires withdrawing the projections we place on others, owning our shadow, encountering our anima or animus, the contrasexual dimension of the psyche, and ultimately coming into relationship with the self, often symbolized in dreams as a wise old man or woman, a divine child, a mandala, a sacred center. This is not about achieving social success, but about achieving psychological wholeness. A person who individuates might appear to others as eccentric or difficult, might withdraw from social ambitions, might seem to have renounced the normal goals of life. But inwardly, such a person has achieved a rare integration, a bringing together of conscious and unconscious, a lived connection with what Jung called the objective psyche. Can you hear how different these visions of healing are? One seeks community, the other seeks wholeness. One faces outward to human relationships, the other faces inward to archetypal depths. One asks, how can this person contribute to society? The other asks, what is this person's unique destiny, the shape their soul is trying to take? Let us move deeper now into the heart of their difference, into the conceptual landscape where their ideas both touch and diverge. We begin with inferiority, that feeling Adler placed at the center of his psychology, and compare it to Jung's understanding of the shadow, that part of ourselves we reject and repress. For Adler, inferiority feeling was universal and foundational. Every child experiences inferiority because every child is literally smaller, weaker, more dependent than the adults around them. This is not pathological. It is the natural condition of childhood. What matters is how the child responds to this feeling. In a supportive environment, the child develops healthy ways of compensating, learning skills, growing stronger, eventually overcoming the initial weakness. But in an environment marked by neglect, excessive pampering, or harsh criticism, the child may develop an inferiority complex, a conviction of fundamental inadequacy that persists into adulthood and drives compensatory behaviors that are often self-defeating or antisocial. The person with an inferiority complex might overcompensate, developing an exaggerated striving for superiority, seeking to dominate others, to accumulate wealth or status or power as proof of worth. Or they might undercompensate, giving up, developing symptoms of illness or anxiety that allow them to avoid the tests where they fear they would fail. Either way, the inferiority complex prevents genuine social interest from developing. The person remains locked in comparison, measuring themselves against others, unable to experience the simple joy of contribution and belonging that characterizes psychological health. Jung knew about inferiority feelings, but he understood them differently. For Jung, the sense of inadequacy often arose from the split between persona and shadow. The persona is the mask we wear in social life, the role we adopt, the face we present to the world. We identify with certain qualities. I am kind, I am intelligent, I am strong, and these identifications form our conscious self-image, our ego. But inevitably, there are qualities we reject, aspects of ourselves that don't fit the persona, that threaten our self-image or our social acceptance. These rejected qualities sink into the unconscious, forming the shadow. The shadow contains not just our worst qualities, but often our best ones as well. The capacities and potentials we have denied because they didn't fit the narrow definition of self we adopted. A person who identifies entirely with being good and responsible may have a shadow containing spontaneity and wildness. A person who sees themselves as rational and intellectual may have a shadow containing emotional depth and intuitive knowing. The shadow is everything we are, but refuse to recognize. Inferiority feelings, in Jung's view, often arise when we compare our conscious persona with others and find ourselves lacking. But this comparison is based on a false premise, because we are comparing only the partial, conscious self against others' personas while remaining ignorant of our own shadow potentials. The therapeutic task is not to overcome inferiority through striving and achievement, but to integrate the shadow, to recognize and accept the rejected parts of ourselves, to become whole rather than superior. Consider a case that might have come to either therapist. A young man arrives in the consulting room, visibly anxious, complaining of fear of public speaking that threatens his career advancement. He is intelligent, well-educated, but whenever he must present his ideas to a group, he freezes, his mind goes blank, his heart races. He has begun to avoid situations where he might be called upon to speak, and this avoidance is now limiting his professional options. Adler would listen carefully to this man's story, not just to the symptom, but to the whole lifestyle pattern. He would ask about early memories, particularly the first memory the man could recall, because Adler believed that earliest memories revealed the person's fundamental orientation to life. The man might remember being laughed at by classmates when he mispronounced a word while reading aloud in school. Or he might remember his older brother always being praised for eloquence, while he himself was told he was the quiet one. From such memories and from understanding the family constellation, Adler would begin to see the private logic. I am not good at speaking. Others are better. If I speak, I will be exposed as inferior. The symptom, in Adler's view, serves a purpose. The anxiety about public speaking protects the man from having to face the test and possibly fail. If he freezes or avoids, he can maintain the fiction that he could speak well if only the anxiety didn't interfere. The anxiety is both the problem and the solution, the obstacle that allows him to sidestep a challenge he believes he cannot meet. This is what Adler called the neurotic arrangement, the way symptoms arrange the world to fit the person's private logic and protect the goal of maintaining a sense of superiority, or at least avoiding proven inferiority. Therapy would focus on encouragement and reorientation. Adler would help the man see how his fear of speaking serves his style of life, how it protects him from comparison and competition, but also isolates him and prevents genuine contribution. The goal would be to develop courage, literally, from the French coeur, heart, and social interest. The man needs to recognize that his value doesn't depend on being superior to others in eloquence, that he has contributions to make regardless of his speaking ability, that he belongs to the human community not through achievement but through participation. Adler might encourage small steps, gradual exposure, practicing speaking in supportive environments. The focus would be practical, behavioral, oriented toward real-world functioning. Jung would approach the same case entirely differently. He would certainly listen to the personal history, but he would be most interested in the man's dreams and fantasies, in what happened in the moments before the anxiety struck. What images arose in his mind? What did he fear would happen if he spoke? Jung might discover that beneath the fear of public speaking lay a deeper fear of being taken over, of losing control, of something within him speaking that he couldn't regulate. Jung might explore whether this man had constructed a persona of rationality and control, a conscious identity built on being measured and careful, and whether his shadow contained impulses towards spontaneity, emotion, wildness that terrified him because they threatened his conscious self-image. The anxiety might arise not from fear of social judgment, as Adler would emphasize, but from an unconscious conflict between ego and shadow, between the controlled self the man identified with and the uncontrolled forces he feared lay within. In dreams, Jung might find symbolic material pointing toward this conflict. Perhaps the man dreams of being on stage when suddenly a wild animal rushes out of the wings. Perhaps he dreams of opening his mouth to speak and having strange words pour out, words in an unknown language. Jung would amplify these symbols, connecting them to mythological motifs of possession, of speaking in tongues, of the god Dionysus breaking through the Apollonian order. He would help the man see that what he feared was not primarily social judgment, but his own unconscious, the parts of himself he had rejected. The therapeutic work would focus on integration, on helping the man develop a relationship with his shadow, to recognize that the spontaneous, emotional, less controlled parts of himself were not enemies to be suppressed, but aspects of his wholeness to be integrated. As he became more comfortable with his own depth and complexity, the anxiety might resolve not because he had developed better speaking techniques, but because he was no longer at war with himself, no longer so rigidly identified with a narrow persona that any deviation felt like annihilation. Do you see the difference in these approaches? Adler looks at the social meaning of the symptom, the way it positions the person in relationship to others, the goals it serves in the economy of striving and belonging. Jung looks at the symbolic meaning, the way it reflects an inner split, the dynamics between consciousness and the unconscious, the call toward integration and wholeness. For Adler, the answer is encouragement and social reorientation. For Jung, the answer is symbolic exploration and psychic integration. Neither is wrong. They are illuminating different dimensions of human experience. A person is both a social being and a symbolic being, both embedded in relationships and carrying an inner world of images and archetypal patterns. Perhaps the young man's anxiety does arise from early social experiences that created a sense of inferiority, and perhaps it also reflects an inner conflict between persona and shadow. Perhaps he needs both encouragement to re-engage with the social world and inner work to integrate rejected aspects of himself. The two approaches need not exclude each other. But Adler and Jung themselves were often in the position of mutual exclusion, each so convinced of the primacy of his own approach that he tended to dismiss the other's insights. Adler saw Jung's focus on symbols and archetypes as mystical evasion, a refusal to face the concrete realities of social life and the pragmatic work of developing community feeling. Jung saw Adler's focus on social adjustment as superficial, a reduction of the psyche to social mechanics, missing the depth and mystery of the unconscious, the numinous dimension of human experience. Let us consider another point of comparison: their views on childhood development and the formation of personality. For Adler, childhood was the time when the lifestyle crystallized, when the patterns of striving and the basic orientation to life were established. The family constellation birth order, parental attitudes, early experiences of inferiority or encouragement created the template that would shape all later behavior. The firstborn learned to expect attention and responsibility, then felt dethroned by younger siblings and might develop a conservative, authority-oriented personality. The second-born was always playing catch-up, competing with the older sibling, perhaps becoming a revolutionary or an achiever who surpassed the firstborn through exceptional effort. The youngest was the baby, potentially pampered, perhaps remaining dependent or developing an unexpected drive to overtake all the older siblings. The only child never learned to share attention and might struggle with cooperation. These patterns were not deterministic but probabilistic. Adler believed that people could change, that therapy could help reorient the lifestyle, that insight into one's private logic could create freedom to choose different strategies for living. But the early patterns remained influential, leaving their mark on personality in ways that could be observed across the lifespan. Jung paid less attention to birth order and family structure. He acknowledged that early relationships mattered, that the mother complex or father complex could shape personality, but these were understood not primarily as the result of actual parental behavior, but as the personal manifestation of archetypal dynamics. A mother complex arose not just because of what one's particular mother did or didn't do, but because the mother figure carried the projection of the mother archetype, that primordial image of the nourishing, containing, and potentially devouring feminine. A father complex reflected not just the personal father, but the father archetype, the principle of authority, law, order, and consciousness. For Jung, childhood was important as the time before ego consciousness fully crystallized, when the child still lived in participation mystique, in a state of unconscious identification with the environment, particularly with the mother. As the ego developed and separated from this original unity, the child gained consciousness, but also lost the connection to the unconscious, creating the split that would need to be healed in the second half of life through the process of individuation. But Jung's real interest was not in how childhood shaped personality, but in how the archetypal unconscious guided development throughout life. He believed that each person carried within them a potential pattern of wholeness, an image of what they could become, symbolized by the self-archetype. Life was a process of gradually realizing this potential, of the unconscious pushing consciousness toward greater wholeness, often through suffering, crisis, and symbolic experiences. Childhood experiences mattered, but they were not determinative in the way Adler suggested. The real determining factor was the archetypal pattern, the destiny that each person carried within their own psyche. This difference reflected a deeper philosophical divide about human nature and the sources of psychological development. Adler was firmly in the camp of social constructionism. He believed that personality was shaped by social experience, that the meanings we assign to events were learned through social interaction, that our goals and strivings were responses to social position and social feedback. There was no fixed human nature, only the universal experience of childhood inferiority and the creative ways individuals develop to cope with and overcome it. Jung, by contrast, was a biological essentialist in a certain sense, though his biology was strange and metaphorical. He believed in the proven, inherited, collective unconscious, in archetypal structures that preceded individual experience, in patterns that were not learned, but given, part of the deep structure of the human psyche. Just as our bodies inherited physical structures from evolutionary history, our minds inherited psychic structures, the archetypes that shaped how we perceived and responded to experience. These archetypes were not social constructs, but transpersonal realities, expressions of what Jung called the objective psyche. Consider how they each understood the opposite sex. Adler saw gender roles as largely socially constructed, the product of what he called the masculine protest, the tendency in patriarchal societies to value masculine traits and devalue feminine ones, creating in both men and women a striving to appear strong, dominant, masculine, according to the culture's definition, and to avoid appearing weak, submissive, feminine. Men developed exaggerated masculine behaviors to prove their superiority. Women either submitted to inferior roles or developed their own masculine protest, striving for equality and rejecting traditional feminine expectations. This analysis was remarkably progressive for its time. Adler was an early supporter of women's rights, recognizing that women's supposedly natural characteristics were largely the result of social oppression and limited opportunities. He believed that as society became more egalitarian, as women gained equal education and opportunity, gender differences in personality and behavior would diminish. He saw neurosis in women often as the result of the conflict between their own aspirations and the narrow roles society permitted them. Jung had a completely different understanding of gender. He believed in deep, archetypal differences between masculine and feminine that were not simply social constructs. But he complicated this by arguing that every person contained both masculine and feminine dimensions. Men's conscious personality was typically masculine, but they carried an unconscious feminine dimension Jung called the anima. Women's conscious personality was typically feminine, but they carried an unconscious masculine dimension called the animus. These contrasexual dimensions of the psyche were not the result of socialization, but were inherent archetypal structures. The anima in men was the personification of the unconscious, often appearing in dreams as a woman, sometimes seductive, sometimes wise, sometimes threatening. A man's relationship with his anima determined his relationship with his own unconscious, and also colored his relationships with actual women, onto whom he tended to project his anima image. Psychological development for men required withdrawing these projections, entering into conscious relationship with the anima as an inner figure, honoring the feminine within, rather than seeking it only in outer relationships. Similarly, the animus in women appeared as a masculine figure or figures in dreams, representing her potential for consciousness, assertion, spiritual questing. A woman needed to develop relationship with her animus, to integrate this masculine dimension, to find within herself the qualities of focused consciousness and spiritual authority that her culture might have told her belonged only to men. Jung's view was more complex than simple biological determinism, but it retained an essentialism that Adler rejected. For Jung, masculine and feminine were real principles, cosmic in scope, reflected in symbols like sun and moon, spirit and matter, consciousness and unconscious. They were not merely social roles that could be discarded, but archetypal realities that needed to be understood and integrated. A man who rejected his masculine heritage, or a woman who rejected her feminine nature, would become alienated from their own archetypal ground. But each also needed to integrate the contrasexual other within themselves to achieve wholeness. Adler would have seen Jung's anima and animus as mystifications of social gender roles, as taking culturally constructed categories and elevating them to cosmic principles, thereby reinforcing the very stereotypes that limited human potential. Jung would have seen Adler's reduction of gender to social construction as missing the deep symbolic and archetypal dimensions, the numinous reality of masculine and feminine as organizing principles of the psyche. Here we see a pattern that runs through all their differences. Adler reduces to the social, to the horizontal dimension of human relationship and social positioning. Jung expands to the symbolic and archetypal, to the vertical dimension of depth, psychology, and transpersonal reality. Adler is the Democrat, emphasizing equality, community, social utility. Jung is the priest of mysteries, emphasizing uniqueness, individuation, symbolic truth. Let us explore another arena where their differences illuminate: the understanding of dreams. We have touched on this, but it deserves deeper attention, for dreams were crucial to both men's practice, yet they approached them in completely opposite ways. For Jung, dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, to use Freud's phrase, though Jung meant something different by it than Freud did. Dreams were not merely wish fulfillments or disguised expressions of repressed content. They were compensatory to consciousness, bringing forth what consciousness had neglected or rejected, offering perspectives and insights that balance the ego's one-sidedness. Dreams spoke in the language of symbols, and these symbols connected to the collective unconscious, to archetypal patterns that transcended personal experience. Jung developed a method he called amplification. When a patient brought a dream, Jung would ask for personal associations but would not stop there. He would add amplifications from mythology, fairy tales, religious symbolism, alchemy, showing how the images in the dream connected to universal human patterns. A dream of a descent into a dark cave might be amplified by references to Jonah in The Whale, to Dionysus in the underworld, to the alchemical Negredo, to initiatory rites of death and rebirth. The dreamer was not just an individual with personal problems, but a person caught up in archetypal processes, living out timeless human dramas. This approach gave dreams enormous weight and significance. Jung would spend whole sessions, even whole series of sessions, exploring a single dream. He encouraged patients to paint their dreams, to sculpt them, to engage with dream images through active imagination, a technique where one entered into dialogue with dream figures while awake, allowing the unconscious to speak directly to consciousness in a structured way. Dreams, for Jung, were prospective as well as retrospective. They didn't just look back at past traumas, but looked forward to future possibilities, showing the direction in which the unconscious was trying to move, the potential wholeness it was pointing toward. A dream could anticipate a coming life change, could show what the psyche needed to develop next, could warn of dangers the conscious mind hadn't yet recognized. Adler's approach to dreams was radically different and much more modest. He saw dreams as part of the lifestyle, as expressions of the same private logic that organized waking behavior. Dreams were rehearsals or preparations, usually for some problem or challenge the person faced. They created a mood, often a mood that supported the person's goals or validated their hesitations. A person who secretly wanted to avoid an exam might dream of missing the train, creating a mood of anxiety about transportation that could justify avoiding the test. A person planning to end a relationship might dream of betrayal, creating a mood of righteous anger that supported the decision to leave. Dreams, in Adler's view, didn't need elaborate interpretation. They were straightforward expressions of the dreamer's concerns and intentions, though these might be unconscious. The question to ask was not, what does this symbol mean in the universal sense? But, what problem is the dreamer facing, and how does this dream help them deal with it or avoid it? Adler was skeptical of the claim that dreams contained wisdom from a deeper self. He saw them as products of the same ego that created neurotic symptoms, serving the same goals, maintaining the same stance toward life. Dreams could be useful in therapy, not because they revealed archetypal truths, but because they revealed lifestyle patterns and private logic in a condensed form. But Adler didn't privilege dreams the way Jung did. They were just one source of information among many early memories, family constellation, observable behavior in the present moment. This difference in approach to dreams reflected their different understandings of the unconscious itself. For Jung, the unconscious was vast, deep, potentially wise, the source of creativity and spiritual insight, the realm where the archetypes dwelt. The unconscious was not merely personal, the repository of forgotten memories and repressed desires, but also collective, containing the accumulated wisdom and experience of humanity, structured by archetypal forms that shaped perception and experience in universal ways. For Adler, the unconscious was much less significant. What others called unconscious was simply what the person didn't want to know, what didn't fit their private logic, what would interfere with their goals if it became conscious. Adler sometimes questioned whether the unconscious existed as a separate realm at all, or whether it was just a metaphor for aspects of behavior and motivation the person hadn't yet articulated. He certainly didn't believe in a collective unconscious containing archetypal patterns. Each person's psychology was unique, shaped by their unique social experience and their creative response to that experience. Jung wrote that the unconscious was like an ocean surrounding the small island of consciousness, vast and deep and largely unknown. Consciousness was a recent evolutionary development, thin and fragile, always in danger of being overwhelmed by the unconscious, but also needing the unconscious as the source of renewal and transformation. The work of individuation was not to conquer the unconscious or to make the unconscious conscious, which was impossible, but to develop a relationship between ego and unconscious, a dialogue where each informed and enriched the other. Adler had little patience for oceanic metaphors. For him, the psyche was unified, organized around the goal of overcoming inferiority and achieving significance. What others mystified as unconscious processes were simply the unrecognized implications of one's own goals and strategies. Therapy didn't require diving into depth, but rather gaining a clear view of the patterns organized one's life, recognizing how symptoms served one's goals, and choosing new, more socially useful ways of striving. Consider how each man understood religion and spirituality, for this too reveals the chasm between them. Jung was deeply engaged with religious questions throughout his life. He studied comparative religion, worked extensively with alchemical texts, wrote about the psychology of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Gnosticism. He saw religious symbols as expressions of archetypal realities, as the collective's way of giving form to transpersonal experiences of the numinous, of the sacred, of the mysterium tremendum that Rudolf Otto had described. Jung distinguished between religion and religious creed. Religious creeds were the institutionalized, dogmatic forms, which Jung often criticized for becoming rigid and cut off from living religious experience. But religion itself, the experience of the numinous, the encounter with something greater than the ego, the sense of the sacred, this was central to psychological health. Jung wrote that neurosis often represented a failed religious experience, that people became ill when they lost connection to meaning, when their lives had no sense of participation in something greater than themselves. The images and symbols that arose in religious traditions were not merely social constructions or projections, but were authentic expressions of archetypal realities. The mandala, for instance, appeared in Tibetan Buddhism, in Christian rose windows, in the visions of Jung's patients who knew nothing of these traditions. This was not because of cultural transmission, but because the mandala was an archetypal symbol of the self, of wholeness and centering, and it arose spontaneously from the deep structure of the psyche itself. Jung's psychology was thus inherently spiritual, though he insisted it was not metaphysical. He claimed he did not know whether God existed as an objective reality beyond the psyche. But the God image certainly existed within the psyche as an archetypal reality, as the imago Dei, the self-archetype, the symbol of wholeness and totality that transcended ego consciousness. Whether this inner image corresponded to an outer reality was a question Jung said he could not answer as a psychologist. but the inner reality of the God image was undeniable and of supreme importance for psychological health and development. Adler's relationship to religion was utterly different. He came from a Jewish family, but converted to Christianity, likely for social reasons as much as spiritual ones, given the anti-Semitism of Vienna. But religion played little role in his psychological theorizing. He saw religious belief as a social phenomenon, potentially useful if it encouraged community feeling and social cooperation, potentially harmful if it reinforced hierarchies or encouraged escapism from real-world responsibilities. What Adler valued was not mystical experience or archetypal symbolism, but practical ethics, the commitment to social interest, to contributing to the human community. He saw himself as developing a psychology that could serve social reform, that could help create a more equitable society, that could teach people to cooperate rather than compete destructively. In this sense, his psychology had an ethical and even spiritual dimension, but it was humanistic rather than numinous, focused on human community rather than on transpersonal realities. Adler might have said that Jung's fascination with archetypes and religious symbols was itself a compensatory striving, a way of claiming superiority through special knowledge, through access to depth that ordinary people couldn't reach. The role of the initiate, the priest of psychological mysteries, was itself a form of striving for significance, a way of elevating oneself above the common herd. True psychological health, for Adler, didn't require initiation into mysteries, but simply required developing the courage to be imperfect, to belong to the human community without needing to be superior or special. Jung would have countered that Adler's focus on social adaptation was a defense against depth, a fear of the unconscious, a reduction of the sacred to the social. Life was not just about getting along with others and contributing to society, however valuable those aims might be. Life was about meaning, about finding one's unique path, about encountering the mystery of existence, about the soul's journey toward wholeness. To reduce all this to social mechanics was to impoverish human experience, to deny the spiritual hunger that drove people to seek meaning beyond social utility. Can you feel how each man's critique of the other contained truth? Adler was right that Jung's psychology could become elitist, that the emphasis on special knowledge and symbolic interpretation could distance the therapist from the patient, that not everyone needed to explore archetypal depths to live a satisfying life. Jung was right that Adler's psychology could become reductive, that the focus on social adjustment could ignore the depths of human experience, that meaning and transcendence were real needs that couldn't be satisfied only through community belonging. Let us turn now to the question of therapy itself, of healing, of what it meant for each man to say a patient had gotten better. For this is perhaps the most practical and also the most revealing arena of their difference. Adler's therapeutic goals were clear and concrete. A person who came for therapy was struggling in one or more of what Adler called the 3 life tasks: work, love, and community. They might be failing at their job or unable to find satisfying work. They might be unable to form intimate relationships or trapped in destructive partnerships. They might be isolated, without friends, unable to cooperate with others or contribute to the common good. These failures were symptoms of deep discouragement, of an exaggerated inferiority feeling and compensatory striving that prevented genuine social interest from developing. Therapy aimed to help the person recognize their lifestyle patterns, see how their symptoms serve their private goals, and develop the courage to engage with life's tasks directly rather than through neurotic detours. The therapist's role was that of an encouraging teacher or coach, helping the person see their strengths, challenging their excuses, reframing their assumptions, offering a model of social interest through the therapeutic relationship itself. Adler pioneered what would later be called brief therapy. He believed that change could happen relatively quickly once the person gained insight into their lifestyle and made the decision to reorient towards social interest. He was practical and active, giving advice, suggesting homework, sometimes meeting with whole families, establishing child guidance clinics where parents could learn more encouraging approaches to raising children. His therapy was democratic in spirit. The therapist was not a distant expert, but a fellow human being offering guidance based on experience and understanding. Crucially, Adler believed the goal of therapy was adaptation to reality and participation in community. A person had recovered when they could work productively, love intimately, and contribute to the community. These were observable, measurable outcomes. You could tell whether someone was doing better by whether they had a job, whether their relationships improved, whether they engaged in social life rather than withdrawing into isolated striving or illness. Jung's therapeutic goals were much harder to define and much less concrete. He was not particularly interested in whether his patients adapted to social expectations. He was interested in whether they became who they truly were, whether they achieved a degree of individuation, whether they integrated unconscious contents and developed a relationship with the self. What did this mean in practice? It might mean a patient leaving a marriage that society expected them to maintain because the marriage prevented their individual development. It might mean someone giving up a prestigious career to pursue a calling that made no social sense but answered an inner need. It might mean embracing aspects of oneself, the shadow, the anima, the animus, that made one seem strange or difficult to others, but that were necessary for wholeness. Jung wrote that he could not tell his patients what was right for them, that each person's path was unique and had to be discovered through exploration of their own unconscious. The therapist was more like a fellow traveler or guide than a teacher with a clear destination in mind. Jung famously said that he couldn't take his patients any further than he himself had gone, that the therapist's own individuation was the most important tool in therapy. Jungian therapy was often long-term, sometimes lasting years. It focused intensively on dreams, on active imagination, on creative work with symbolic material. Jung encouraged patients to paint, to keep dream journals, to engage with the unconscious through multiple channels. The goal was not symptom relief, though symptoms might improve, but transformation of personality, development of a conscious relationship between ego and self. How would you know if someone had made progress in Jungian therapy? Not necessarily by their social adjustment, but by more subtle signs, a new richness in their dream life, a greater acceptance of their shadow, a less rigid persona, more flexibility in how they presented themselves, a sense of meaning and purpose that wasn't dependent on external validation, a capacity to bear tension and ambiguity without needing to resolve everything immediately, a connection to something beyond ego, whether called the self, the divine, the collective unconscious, or simply a sense of participating in something larger than personal existence. These outcomes were internal, subjective, hard to measure. Jung's psychology resisted empirical verification in ways that troubled academic psychologists. How could you prove that someone had integrated their shadow or developed a relationship with their anima? These were experiential realities, phenomenological truths that could only be known from within. Science, in its conventional form, couldn't grasp them. Adler's outcomes were much more amenable to measurement. You could count how many days someone worked, whether their relationships lasted, whether they participated in community activities. This made Adler's psychology more acceptable to the emerging field of scientific psychology, more teachable, more replicable. It also made it more democratic. Anyone could understand the basic concepts of inferiority and striving, of social interest and lifestyle patterns. You didn't need special training in mythology or symbolism to practice Adlerian therapy. But accessibility came at a cost. Adler's psychology, for all its practical wisdom, could seem to lack depth, to miss the numinous dimension of human experience, the mystery and terror and beauty of the psyche's symbolic life. It addressed suffering efficiently, but perhaps didn't honor suffering deeply enough, didn't recognize that some kinds of suffering weren't problems to be solved, but mysteries to be lived, thresholds to be crossed on the way to transformation. Jung's psychology, conversely, honored depth and mystery, but could seem impractical, even self-indulgent. Did the stockbroker who came for help with panic attacks really need to paint mandalas and study alchemy? Might he recover more quickly and efficiently through Adlerian encouragement and reorientation towards social interest? Perhaps the elaborate symbolic work Jung favored was necessary only for certain types of people, those with a natural inclination toward introspection and symbolism, those in the second half of life facing questions of meaning, those called to what Jung himself called the individuation process. Indeed, Jung acknowledged this. He wrote that not everyone needed to individuate in the full sense, that for many people a well-adapted social life was sufficient and appropriate. The individuation process was often triggered by a midlife crisis, by a moment when external achievements no longer satisfied, when the personality structure built in the first half of life focused on establishing oneself in work and relationship began to crack, and deeper questions emerged. What does my life mean? Who am I beyond my roles? What wants to be born in me that I've been suppressing? Adler, by contrast, applied his framework universally. Everyone experienced inferiority. Everyone developed a lifestyle. Everyone needed to develop social interest. His principles were meant to apply across the lifespan and across cultures. They were democratic in the sense that everyone, regardless of special gifts or psychological sophistication, could benefit from understanding their own private logic and reorienting toward community. Let us pause here in our exploration and reflect on what we have traced so far. We have seen two men, both trained as physicians, both drawn to the mysteries of the psyche, both rejecting aspects of Freud's teaching to forge their own paths. But their paths diverged so sharply that they ended in nearly opposite territories. Adler created a psychology of social embeddedness, of human beings as fundamentally communal creatures, shaped by social experience, struggling with social comparison, needing social belonging for health and happiness. His psychology was horizontal, focused on relationships between people, on how we position ourselves relative to others, on how we contribute to or withdraw from the human community. Jung created a psychology of symbolic depth, of human beings as carriers of transpersonal realities, shaped by archetypal patterns, struggling with the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, needing connection to the numinous for meaning and wholeness. His psychology was vertical, focused on the relationship between ego and self, between conscious and unconscious, between the personal and the collective dimensions of the psyche. Adler was optimistic about human nature and social progress. He believed that as society became more equitable, As education spread, as people learned to cooperate rather than compete destructively, psychological health would improve. Neurosis was largely a product of social structures that created excessive competition, inequality, and discouragement. Change the structures, educate people in social interest, and health would naturally improve. Jung was more conservative and more pessimistic about social progress. He saw the archetypal patterns as eternal, not subject to historical change. The shadow, the anima, and animus, the self. These were structural features of the psyche that would be present in every generation, regardless of social arrangements. Social reform might make life more comfortable, but couldn't resolve the fundamental tension between consciousness and unconscious. Couldn't answer the existential questions about meaning and mortality that drove people to seek psychological help. Adler focused on the future. His psychology was teleological in a practical sense, oriented toward goals, toward where the person was striving to go. Early memories mattered because they revealed the fundamental orientation toward life, but therapy was about reorienting toward new, more useful goals. The past was important only as it shaped present striving and future possibilities. Jung focused on the eternal present of the symbolic. His psychology was teleological in a mystical sense, oriented toward the goal of wholeness, the self that existed both as the origin and the destination of the individuation process. The past mattered as personal history, but mattered even more as connection to the collective unconscious, to the primordial images and patterns that transcended individual existence. Therapy was about encountering these timeless dimensions within the temporal flow of one's life. Adler was prosaic, plain speaking, accessible. He wrote in clear language, avoided jargon, wanted his ideas to be usable by teachers, parents, social workers, anyone working with people. He gave public lectures, wrote popular books, believed psychology should serve democracy. Jung was poetic, complex, often obscure. He wrote in dense, elusive prose, coined neologisms, drew on esoteric traditions, seemed sometimes to be writing for a small audience of initiates rather than for general readers. His work required effort to understand, required background in mythology and comparative religion, required a tolerance for ambiguity and paradox. Yet both men were responding to real dimensions of human experience. People do struggle with feelings of inferiority and the need for social belonging. People do encounter symbolic and numinous dimensions that can't be reduced to social mechanics. People do need both community and meaning, both relationship and depth, both practical goals and connection to mystery. Perhaps the tragedy of their separation is that each felt compelled to negate what the other affirmed, to insist that his perspective was the true one and the other's was distortion or evasion. If they could have held both perspectives in creative tension, acknowledged that the psyche has both a social surface and a symbolic depth, that healing requires both community and individuation, both encouragement and exploration, then the history of psychology might have been richer. But such synthesis was beyond them. They were too invested in their own discoveries, too shaped by their different temperaments and life experiences, and so they went their separate ways, each building a school, training followers, establishing institutes and journals, competing for recognition and influence in the emerging field of psychology. Let us move now into deeper waters, into the more meditative and speculative reflection on what their dialogue and their failure to truly dialogue reveals about the nature of the psyche and the limits and possibilities of psychological understanding. This is the territory where we can allow the ideas to resonate and reverberate, where we can wonder rather than conclude, where the boundaries between the thinkers and the thoughts begin to dissolve. There is something deeply human in the split between Adler and Jung, something that mirrors the split within each of us. We are social beings who need belonging, whose identities are shaped in relationship, who suffer when we feel excluded or inferior or unable to contribute. This is the truth Adler saw so clearly. We compare ourselves to others. We measure our worth against social standards. We need to feel that we matter, that we have a place, that our existence makes a difference to the community we belong to. But we are also symbolic beings who need meaning, whose inner lives are shaped by images and stories and patterns that connect us to dimensions beyond the social, who suffer when life feels empty of transcendent significance. This is the truth Jung saw. We dream images that don't come from our personal experience. We hunger for connection to something greater than ourselves. We need to feel that our lives participate in patterns and purposes that extend beyond our individual existence and the social structures we inhabit. These two truths exist in tension. The social dimension pulls us toward conformity, toward adaptation, toward finding our place in the collective. The symbolic dimension pulls us toward individuation, toward uniqueness, toward honoring the voice of the self, even when it contradicts social expectations. Both are necessary. Overemphasis on either creates distortion. A person who lives entirely on Adler's horizontal plane, focused solely on social comparison and community belonging, may achieve successful adaptation but lose touch with depth and meaning. They may wake up at midlife having achieved social success but feeling empty, wondering who they really are beneath the roles they've played, haunted by dreams and symptoms that speak of neglected symbolic dimensions. A person who lives entirely on Jung's vertical axis, focused solely on symbolic exploration and individuation, may achieve inner richness but lose touch with community and practical life. They may become isolated, strange to others, unable to sustain relationships or fulfill basic responsibilities, so absorbed in inner work that they forget they exist in a social world that requires participation. Most of us move between these poles throughout our lives, sometimes needing to focus on social adaptation and belonging, other times needing to withdraw for inner work and symbolic exploration. The healthy psyche is not static, but dynamic, capable of both social engagement and symbolic depth, both horizontal relationship and vertical integration. But Adler and Jung, in their mutual rejection, each denied half of this wholeness. Adler, in his fear of mystification and his commitment to democracy, rejected the transpersonal, the archetypal, the numinous. He wanted to keep psychology grounded in observable social behavior, in measurable outcomes, in practical usefulness. This gave his work clarity and accessibility, but also a certain flatness, a missing dimension that would lead later thinkers to criticize his psychology as too rational, too cognitive, lacking appreciation for the irrational depths of human experience. Jung, in his fear of superficiality and his commitment to depth, rejected the pragmatic, the social, the horizontal dimension of human life. He wanted to explore the transpersonal, the archetypal, the numinous. This gave his work richness and profundity, but also a certain detachment from ordinary life, a potential for elitism and obscurity that would lead critics to see his psychology as mystical, unscientific, inaccessible to those without special training in symbolism. Each needed the other's perspective to balance his own excess. Adler needed Jung's depth to prevent his psychology from becoming merely a technology of social adjustment. Jung needed Adler's pragmatism to prevent his psychology from becoming merely an esoteric pursuit disconnected from ordinary human concerns. In the history of psychology since their time, we can see how both streams have continued, sometimes in opposition, sometimes in creative synthesis. The humanistic psychology of the 1950s and 60s, Maslow, Rogers, Rollo, May, attempted to bridge this gap, honoring both social relationships and transpersonal dimensions, both community and individuation. Existential psychology emphasized meaning and authenticity in ways that echoed Jung while remaining more grounded in lived experience than in archetypal symbolism. Cognitive behavioral therapy developed Adler's pragmatic focus on belief systems and lifestyle patterns while largely ignoring symbolic depth. Contemporary trauma therapy is discovering that both perspectives are necessary. Trauma lives in the body, and in the social sphere, it's about relationships that fail to provide safety, about nervous systems dysregulated by threat, about needing to restore a sense of social connection and community. This is Adlerian territory. But trauma also lives in symbols and images. It's about stories that need to be retold, images that need to be witnessed, meanings that need to be found in suffering. This is Jungian territory. Effective trauma therapy seems to require both dimensions. The practical work of creating safety and restoring social connection, and the symbolic work of integrating experience through narrative and meaning-making. There is a poignancy in imagining what might have happened if Adler and Jung had truly listened to each other rather than simply defending their own territories. What if Adler had taken seriously Jung's observation that people hunger for meaning and connection to the numinous, that social adaptation alone doesn't satisfy the deepest human needs? He might have developed a richer understanding of the spiritual dimension of social interest, of how contribution to community can be a form of participating in something transcendent. What if Jung had taken seriously Adler's observation that personality is shaped by social experience, that power dynamics and social comparison profoundly influence psychological development? He might have developed a more socially aware understanding of how archetypal patterns manifest differently depending on social position, of how the social context shapes which archetypal possibilities can emerge and which remain dormant. But such mutual recognition would have required a humility that neither man, in the heat of establishing his own school, could quite achieve. They were still proving themselves, still fighting for recognition, still needing to differentiate their approaches clearly to gather followers and establish institutions. The intellectual and institutional pressures of their time push them towards schism rather than synthesis. Consider the question of the goal of human life, of psychological health, of what we are here to do and become. For Adler, the goal was clear: to develop social interest, to overcome feelings of inferiority not through isolated striving for superiority, but through finding one's place in the human community and contributing to the common good. A healthy person works productively, loves intimately, participates in community life. They have overcome the neurotic need to be superior and accepted the democratic truth that all humans are equal in value, each contributing according to their capacities. This is a beautiful vision, ethical and democratic, emphasizing equality and community. It resonates with the great religious and philosophical teachings about love and service. The biblical command to love your neighbor as yourself, the Buddhist practice of compassion for all sentient beings, the humanistic emphasis on dignity and rights, all these harmonize with Adler's vision of social interest as the mark of psychological health. But is this enough? Is human life fully described by work, love, and community, however essential these are? What about the hunger for meaning that persists even when social life is satisfying? What about the mystical experiences that break through unbidden, shattering, comfortable adaptation? What about the person who has achieved all three life tasks but still feels haunted by a sense that something essential is missing, some dimension of existence they haven't touched? Jung's vision of individuation addresses this hunger. The goal is not social adaptation, but becoming who you truly are in your unique essence, integrating consciousness and unconscious, ego and self, developing your own relationship with the divine or the numinous or whatever term you use for that which transcends personal existence. A healthy person has developed a conscious relationship with their own depths, can bear the tension of opposites within themselves, has accessed creative potential through dialogue with the unconscious, lives with a sense of meaning that connects their personal life to transpersonal patterns. This, too, is a beautiful vision, spiritual and individuating, emphasizing uniqueness and depth. It resonates with mystical traditions across cultures. The Delphic oracle's command to know yourself, the Upanishadic teaching of Atman and Brahman, the Christian mysticism of the divine spark within all these harmonize with Jung's vision of individuation as the mark of psychological health. But is this enough? Is human life fully described by the journey inward to the self, however profound that journey is? What about the ethical demands of justice and compassion? What about the person who has achieved inner wholeness but remains indifferent to suffering in the world, content to explore symbolic depths while ignoring social responsibilities? What about the potential for individuation to become spiritual narcissism, a turning away from others in pursuit of inner perfection? Each vision is incomplete without the other. Social interest without depth can become mere conformity, adjustment to unjust systems, loss of individual authenticity. Individuation without social awareness can become narcissistic withdrawal, privileged navel-gazing, disconnection from the suffering and needs of others. The integrated vision would honor both. It would recognize that humans need both community and solitude, both relationship and inner work, both contribution to the social good and attention to personal meaning. It would acknowledge that these needs exist in tension, that we must constantly balance between them, that at different life stages and in different circumstances, one or the other may take priority. In youth and early adulthood, the tasks of establishing oneself socially, finding work, forming relationships, building a place in community naturally take precedence. This is the Adlerian territory, the time when social interest needs to develop, when one learns to cooperate and contribute. But even here, attention to inner life and meaning-making is necessary to prevent mere conformity. In midlife and beyond, the tasks of individuation, finding personal meaning, integrating neglected aspects of self, developing relationship with the transpersonal often become more urgent. This is the Jungian territory, the time when social adaptation is no longer enough, when deeper questions demand attention. But even here, connection to community and ethical responsibility remain essential to prevent narcissistic withdrawal. Throughout life, we move between these poles, now focusing outward on relationships and responsibilities, now turning inward for reflection and integration, now extending outward again with new understanding to contribute more deeply to community. The rhythm of this movement, the dance between horizontal and vertical, between social and symbolic, between Adler and Jung, this is the dance of a whole life. Let us consider one final comparison, perhaps the most revealing. How each man understood what we might call the religious impulse, the spiritual hunger that seems universal in human experience, manifesting in different forms across cultures and individuals. For Adler, spiritual or religious feelings were essentially expressions of social interest in its highest form. When people spoke of loving all humanity, of serving God through serving others, of feeling connected to the universe, they were expressing in poetic or religious language the psychological reality of Gemeinschaftsgefühl, community feeling extended to its widest possible scope. Religion at its best taught cooperation, compassion, equality before God, service to others, all values that aligned with psychological health as Adler understood it. Religion could also, however, reinforce neurotic patterns. When it emphasized the superiority of believers over non-believers, when it created hierarchies that violated human equality, when it promised rewards in heaven as compensation for failure to achieve significance in earthly life, when it encouraged passivity and submission rather than active contribution, then religion was part of the problem rather than the solution. It was reinforcing inferiority feelings rather than helping people develop courage and social interest. Adler's approach was therefore pragmatic. He would ask, does this religious belief or practice increase social interest or decrease it? Does it help people cooperate and contribute, or does it divide them and encourage either arrogant superiority or helpless inferiority? The truth of religious claims was less important than their psychological and social effects. This approach has a certain wisdom. Religion has indeed often served both to unite and divide, to encourage both compassion and cruelty, depending on how it's understood and practiced. Adler's pragmatic test, does it increase social interest, offers a useful criterion, but it also reduces religion to its social function, missing what might be called the vertical dimension, the experience of transcendence itself. Jung approached religion entirely differently. For him, the religious impulse was fundamental, irreducible to anything else. It arose from the encounter between ego and self, between consciousness and the numinous dimension of the unconscious. Religious experiences, visions, mystical states, encounters with the sacred were real psychic events, expressions of the objective psyche, breaking through into consciousness. Religious symbols were not merely social constructs or useful fictions, but were genuine revelations of archetypal realities. The image of God was the self projected outward, the archetypal image of wholeness and totality. Religious rituals and practices were ways of maintaining connection between consciousness and the unconscious, between human and divine, between the personal and the transpersonal. Jung saw neurosis often as failed religious experience, as the psyche's attempt to achieve transformation and transcendence being thwarted by a too narrow consciousness that rejected the irrational and numinous. Modern people, having lost connection to traditional religious forms without finding adequate substitutes, were suffering from spiritual hunger, from the absence of meaningful connection to the transpersonal realm. His approach was therefore phenomenological and reverential. He would ask, What is the symbolic meaning of this religious image or experience? How does it express archetypal patterns? How can we honor the numinous dimension without being overwhelmed by it, integrating spiritual experience into conscious life? The social effects of religion mattered less than its psychological truth, its capacity to connect people to the depths of their own being. This approach also has wisdom. It honors the depth and power of religious experience, recognizing that something in the human psyche hunger for transcendence, for connection to mystery, for participation in meaning that extends beyond personal and social existence. But it can also seem to privatize religion, to reduce the divine to a psychological category, to ignore the ethical demands and communal dimensions that are central to most religious traditions. Again, each perspective needs the other. The religious impulse is both social and symbolic, both horizontal and vertical. Religion, at its best, creates community, binds people together in shared meaning and mutual responsibility, teaches compassion and justice. This is the dimension Adler saw. But religion at its best also connects people to transcendence, opens consciousness to the numinous, facilitates transformation through encounter with the sacred. This is the dimension Jung saw. A mature spirituality would honor both. It would recognize that spiritual practice requires both ethical action in the world and inner work with the divine, both service to community and personal encounter with mystery, both prophetic social justice and mystical contemplation. The great spiritual teachers have often embodied this integration. Buddha taught both compassion for all beings and rigorous inner discipline of meditation. Jesus taught both love of neighbor and private prayer in the desert. The Taoist sage moves between engaged action in the world and withdrawn contemplation of the Tao. But integrating these dimensions is difficult, perhaps the work of a lifetime, requiring constant attention and adjustment. It's easier to emphasize one pole or the other, to be either the social activist who dismisses inner work as self-indulgent, or the mystic who dismisses social action as spiritually immature. Adler and Jung, in their own ways, each fell into one side of this polarity, each championing one essential dimension while neglecting the other. As we approach the end of our exploration, let us allow the insights of both men to rest together in our awareness, neither choosing between them nor trying to force a premature synthesis, but simply holding the tension of their different truths. This itself is a practice that Jung would have recognized, the holding of opposites, allowing them to constellate something new without collapsing into one side or the other. And it's a practice that Adler would have recognized too, the recognition that different perspectives each contain partial truth, that we must cooperate even with those who see differently, that rigid insistence on one's own rightness prevents the social interests that allows new possibilities to emerge. The human psyche is vast enough to contain both men's visions. We are social beings shaped by relationship and comparison, and we are symbolic beings guided by archetypal patterns. We need community, and we need solitude. We need to contribute, and we need to individuate. We need to face outward to others and inward to self. We need encouragement, and we need depth. We need practical goals, and we need transcendent meaning. The tragedy of Adler and Jung's separation is that each felt compelled to negate the other's truth rather than recognizing it as complementary to his own. But perhaps this separation was necessary for each to develop his vision fully, to explore one dimension of human experience with the thoroughness and devotion it deserved. Perhaps now, with more than a century of perspective, We can receive both inheritances, can honor both voices, can allow their dialogue to continue in us. Imagine for a moment that you are sitting in a room with both men present. Adler is practical, warm, accessible, speaking plainly about social relationships and the courage to be imperfect. Jung is intense, complex, mysterious, speaking in symbols about archetypes and individuation. Each listens as the other speaks. Each recognizes that the other is describing real aspects of human experience, even if they emphasize different dimensions. Adler says, "People suffer because they feel inferior, because they believe they don't belong, because they haven't developed the courage to contribute to community. Help them see their lifestyle patterns, encourage them, teach them about social interest, and they will recover their capacity for work, love, and community." Jung says, "People suffer because they've lost connection to depth, because they've identified with a narrow persona and rejected their shadow, because they haven't encountered the self. Help them explore their dreams, amplify the symbols, guide them toward individuation, and they will find meaning and wholeness. Both are true." The question for any particular person at any particular moment is which truth is most relevant, which medicine is most needed. Someone in the depths of social isolation and feelings of worthlessness may need Adler's encouragement and reorientation toward community before they can do the deep symbolic work Jung describes. Someone who has achieved social success but feels empty may need Jung's invitation to explore symbolic depths before they can develop authentic social interest rather than mere conformity. A skillful therapist, a mature human being, knows how to move between these registers, when to offer encouragement and when to invite exploration, when to focus on social relationships and when to attend to dreams and symbols, when to emphasize the horizontal dimension and when to honor the vertical. This is the synthesis that neither Adler nor Jung fully achieved, but that their combined legacy offers us. It's not a theoretical synthesis, but a practical wisdom, a capacity to recognize which dimension of human experience is calling for attention in this moment, with this person, in this situation. Sometimes we need the social pragmatism of Adler. Sometimes we need the symbolic depth of Jung. Often we need both, holding them in creative tension, allowing each to balance and inform the other. As you drift towards sleep now, let these images and ideas settle into your mind like sediment falling through water, each concept finding its natural place, no longer in conflict but in constellation, each truth illuminating different facets of the mystery of human consciousness. Picture the young men in Vienna, gathered around Freud, not yet knowing how their paths would diverge, still open to each other's insights, still friends and colleagues exploring the new territories of depth psychology. There was a moment, brief and precious, when the three of them, Freud, Adler, Jung, represented a wholeness, each bringing different gifts, different perspectives, together mapping a landscape vast enough to contain all their visions. But that moment passed. Human ego entered, the need to be right, to be recognized, to build schools and establish authority. The work of mutual listening and integration gave way to the work of differentiation and competition. This too was perhaps necessary, part of how ideas develop and spread, part of how the complexity of human psychology could be explored from multiple angles. Now we inherit their separation and can attempt the integration they couldn't achieve. We can honor Adler's insight that we are social beings who need belonging and contribution. We can honor Jung's insight that we are symbolic beings who need meaning and depth. We can recognize that both dimensions are essential, that a full human life requires both horizontal relationship and vertical integration, both community and individuation. Let yourself feel the truth of both perspectives in your own life. Notice the times you've felt diminished by comparison, inferior to others, doubting your place in the community. This is the experience Adler understood so well. Notice the encouragement you've needed and received, the times when developing courage and social interest helped you move through difficult passages. This is Adler's gift to you. Notice also the times you felt called by something you couldn't quite name, when dreams brought images that seemed to come from beyond your personal experience, when synchronicities suggested that reality was more meaningful than mere causation could explain. Notice the hunger for transcendence, for connection to mystery, for a sense that your life participates in patterns larger than your individual existence. This is the experience Jung understood so well, and his gift to you is the invitation to honor these experiences, to explore symbolic depths, to trust that individuation, the becoming of who you truly are, is a worthy lifelong pursuit. You contain both men's truths. You are both the Adlerian striving individual seeking place and significance in community, and the Jungian individuating soul seeking meaning and wholeness through integration of consciousness and unconscious. These are not contradictory, but complementary dimensions of your being. In your social life, in your work and relationships, you navigate the terrain Adler mapped. You deal with feelings of inadequacy and superiority, with comparison and competition, with a challenge of developing genuine community feeling rather than isolated striving. You need encouragement. You need to recognize your lifestyle patterns and private logic. You need to develop the courage to be imperfect, to contribute despite your limitations, to belong to the human community not through superiority but through participation. In your inner life, in your dreams and creative expressions and spiritual longings, you navigate the terrain Jung mapped. You encounter symbols that connect you to the collective unconscious. You face your shadow, those aspects of yourself you've rejected. You meet the contrasexual dimension within you, the anima or animus that opens you to the unconscious. You sense the presence of the self, that center of wholeness that transcends your ego's understanding. You need depth. You need to honor the symbolic dimension of experience. You need to trust the individuation process, the unique path your soul is trying to take. Both dimensions ask for your attention. Both deserve your respect. Neither should be collapsed into the other. The social cannot be reduced to the symbolic, and the symbolic cannot be reduced to the social. They are two languages for describing different but equally real aspects of human experience. As sleep approaches, let go of the need to choose between them. Let go of the need to decide who was right, Adler or Jung. Let their voices blend into a chorus, each contributing a different melody, creating a harmony richer than either voice alone. The horizontal and the vertical, the social and the symbolic, the community and the self, all these are dimensions of the one vast mystery of human being. Adler reminds you that you belong, that your worth doesn't depend on superiority, that you have contributions to make, that social interest is both the path and the goal of psychological health. Listen to this voice when isolation threatens, when comparison diminishes you, when you've forgotten that you are part of the human family. Jung reminds you that you are unique, that your soul has a destiny, that depth calls to you, that individuation is the work of becoming whole. Listen to this voice when conformity threatens, when superficiality empties you, when you've forgotten that you are part of the cosmic dance of consciousness and unconscious, playing out patterns older than human history. The dialogue between these voices continues in you, as it continues in all of us, as it continued in psychology throughout the 20th century and continues now in the 21st. Their separation created two streams that have flowed through the landscape of psychology, sometimes parallel, sometimes diverging, sometimes in the work of later thinkers coming back together to water the same ground. Viktor Frankl, survivor of the concentration camps, founder of logotherapy, combined Adler's emphasis on meaning and social connection with Jung's emphasis on spiritual transcendence. Abraham Maslow described the hierarchy of needs that began with basic survival and social belonging. The Adlerian territory but culminated in self-actualization and transcendence, the Jungian territory. James Hillman, Jung's heir, brought archetypal psychology into dialogue with politics and culture, insisting that depth psychology must attend to the social realm, that soul and society cannot be separated. These and many other thinkers have worked to bridge the gap that Adler and Jung's separation created. Their work reminds us that the split was never inevitable, that synthesis is possible, that we can honor both the social and the symbolic, both the horizontal and the vertical, both the community and the self. In your own life, you are the place where this synthesis can happen. You are the living meeting point of these different truths. You contain both the Adlerian striving for belonging and the Jungian journey toward wholeness. You need both encouragement and depth, both community and solitude, both social engagement and symbolic exploration. The work is not to choose one or the other, but to develop the capacity to move between them, to know when each is needed, to honor both dimensions as essential to a full human life. This is the integration that Adler and Jung, in their time and with their temperaments, could not achieve. But it remains available to us, their inheritors, their students, across time. As you cross the threshold into sleep, carry with you both men's blessings. Carry Adler's encouragement. You are enough. You belong. Your contributions matter. Develop courage. Engage with life. Participate in community. You are not alone, and you need not be superior to have worth. Carry also Jung's invitation. You are mystery. You are depth. Honor the symbols. Listen to dreams. Trust the individuation process. Your soul has a unique path. You are connected to something greater than ego, something transpersonal and numinous and sacred. These blessings are not contradictory but complementary, two lights illuminating different aspects of the path you walk. One shines outward, showing you your place among others, the community that awaits your contribution. The other shines inward, showing you the depth you carry, the archetypal ground from which your unique life grows. Walk in both lights. Live in both dimensions. Be both the social being Adler understood and the symbolic being Jung explored. This is the wholeness that their separation paradoxically makes possible, not despite their differences, but because of them, because each explored one dimension so thoroughly that together their work maps the full territory of human psychological and spiritual life. Let your last waking thoughts be of gratitude for both men, for their courage to break with Freud and each other, for their dedication to understanding human suffering and growth, for their different but equally valuable contributions to our understanding of the psyche. They gave us different languages, different maps, different therapeutic approaches. We are richer for both inheritances. And let your first dream images arise from that place beyond the personal, that collective unconscious Jung knew, but let them also reflect your social concerns and strivings, the lifestyle Adler would recognize. You are the meeting place of both psychologies, the living synthesis of what seemed to them irreconcilable differences. Sleep now, wanderer between worlds, carrier of both social hopes and symbolic depths. The dialogue between Adler and Jung continues in you, in all of us who have received their legacy and work to integrate what they held separate. May your dreams tonight be both socially engaged and symbolically rich, both encouraging and transforming, both horizontal and vertical. The conversation between these two great minds has no ending, only continuation in each generation that takes up the questions they asked, the territories they mapped, the truths they spoke from different angles. You are part of that conversation now. You have listened to both voices, felt the pull of both perspectives, recognized both dimensions of your own experience. Carry this complexity with you as you sleep and as you wake. Life is complex enough to need both Adler's social pragmatism and Jung's symbolic depth. The psyche is vast enough to contain both the striving for significance and the journey toward wholeness, both community feeling and individuation, both the horizontal and the vertical. Rest in this knowledge. You need not choose. You can honor both. You can be both a social being seeking belonging and a symbolic being seeking meaning. This is what it means to be fully human, to live in the tension and the dance between these dimensions, allowing each to inform and enrich the other. The night deepens, the dialogue fades to silence. But the silence is full, pregnant with both Adler's and Jung's insights, holding both their truths in that spacious awareness that comes as consciousness releases its grip and sleep arrives. Welcome the dreams that come, whether they speak in Adler's language of social striving or Jung's language of archetypal symbols, whether they show you your place in community or your unique path of individuation. All dreams come from the same source, the same psyche that contains both dimensions, the same human being you are who walks the earth with others and also walks the inner path toward wholeness. Let the story of these two men and their separation and their different wisdoms fade now into the background, becoming part of the vast chorus of insights and perspectives that make up our psychological heritage. You have listened. You have learned. You carry both their truths. Now simply be. Simply rest. The work of integration doesn't happen through effort, but through allowing, through letting the different strands weave themselves together in that creative space beyond conscious control, in that depth where healing and growth happen of their own accord. The conversation between Adler and Jung has lasted more than a century and will last as long as humans wonder about themselves, about what drives us and what we're meant to become, about how we should live together and how we should develop our unique potential. It's a conversation worth continuing, worth returning to, worth letting resonate in your own life. But for now, it's time to rest, time to let the ideas settle, time to cross over into sleep, into that realm where the unconscious speaks in its own language, where social concerns and symbolic depths blend in the strange logic of dreams, where you are neither striving nor individuating, but simply being, simply existing in that primary state before all theories and interpretations. Go gently into that good night, accompanied by both these wise guides, Adler with his encouragement and social understanding, Jung with his symbolic wisdom and archetypal knowledge. Both walk with you. Both speak truths you need. Both are present in the psyche you carry, the life you live, the person you are becoming. The story ends where all good bedtime stories should end, not with answers, but with deeper questions. Not with closure, but with openings. Not with certainty, but with wonder at the mystery and complexity of human consciousness. That inexhaustible subject that Adler and Jung both devoted their lives to exploring, and that you explore simply by being alive, by being human, by being yourself. Sleep well, knowing that you contain both men's insights, that you walk both paths simultaneously, that you are both more social than you think and deeper than you know, both part of the human community and a unique soul on a unique journey. The dialogue continues in you. The synthesis they couldn't achieve might happen in your life, not through grand theory, but through ordinary living, through being present to both dimensions, through honoring both the social and the symbolic, both the horizontal and the vertical, both Adler and Jung. This is enough to take into sleep. This is enough to dream upon. This is enough. Welcome the night. Welcome the dreams, welcome the rest. And when you wake, both men's truths will still be there, still available, still useful, still illuminating the path of being human in all its complexity and richness. For now, sleep. The story is told. The dialogue is heard. The synthesis begins in the silence. Good night, wanderer. Good night, seeker. Good night, soul, navigating between the social and the symbolic, between community and depth, between Adler and Jung. Good night.